Hi guys, #1 Marmaduke fan here, and this is a tried and true Marmaduke Uncut video because I know based on how evil Google is, if I just bring up these key terms in a video, I'll instantly get demonetized. It doesn't matter what I say or what context I add to it. We're going to talk about the offensive terms today, and I want to talk about two tweets. Now, I've always joked I hate Twitter drama, but then I talk about Twitter, and there's actually a reason for that. I've been thinking about this for a while. So, Ben Shapiro might say, oh, Twitter doesn't matter. You turn it off and people don't really behave like that in real life. Your boy Zach, he'll encourage people to leave Twitter because it's a cesspool. And I feel like people who say Twitter isn't the real world are half right. They are right that Twitter doesn't reflect the way people talk to each other normally, I think, or behave normally, because it's sort of your immediate response. It's the first thing you think of when you're hot and bothered, and you splurge that out before you kind of sit and think it through and say, maybe that was kind of dumb, and then you amend what you say in real life because you don't like getting made fun of for saying dumb things. So Twitter takes off that inhibition, and people say the dumb things that come to their mind. But Twitter is the real world in the sense that people are letting you know kind of their immediate gut level thoughts on something, and sometimes people will just sort of neutrally say, yeah, this is what we believe. We hate white people, we hate cis people, we're not shy about that, and we deserve to hate white people and cis people because we are marginalized, because we are oppressed. This is our emotional reaction to our victimization, right? So these two tweets, I thought about both of them individually. I thought maybe these are worth a video. They're actually not that interesting on their own. They're just kind of like little drops in the bucket of the Twitter outrage. But when I looked at both of these together, what's interesting about both of these is they both show, I think, the same logical problem for the emerging left in general, which is if everything is socially constructed, if you don't have objective definitions and terms and ways of identifying things, how do you end up talking about anything? And I think maybe what's interesting is, what does a Black Power activist have in common with a queer theory writer? Like a Black Panther and a professor of lesbian literature. There isn't necessarily anything which says that they have to get along, they have to be allies, they have to vote for similar things, or they have to advance a similar ideology. And yet, the left coalition, the Democrat coalition, tries to cater to both. Is it just a coincidence that they're all bunched up together? Well, I think that there may be like certain logical patterns that lead you to a conclusion, even if that conclusion is ridiculous, because you're following logical patterns to the end. The problem is your premises. You started with a bad premise, you followed logic to its logical end, and you ended up with an absurd conclusion. And I think the bad premise in this case is things are socially constructed. Race is socially constructed. Gender is socially constructed. Your sexual identity or orientation is all socially constructed. Because if that's true, saying something is socially constructed is another way of saying it's not really real in a transcendent or objective sense. We basically have it just because we have it, because society's decided that's the way it's going to be. And you could imagine another society where that isn't the way things are. I think a good illustration of this is, cuss words. Feces is kind of a medical, Latin word. Shit it means the same thing as feces, but shit is seen as a bad word that you don't say in polite society. Why? Is there a logical reason why shit is worse than feces? Well, you don't bring up either in polite society, really, because the idea they connote is kind of gross. You don't want to think about that while you're eating dinner. But for some reason, there's a social convention which decides that shit is an inappropriate way of describing poop, poop is a less offensive way of describing shit, and feces is a less offensive way of describing poop, right? It doesn't really necessarily make any objective sense. We just go along with it because, you don't want to offend the little old ladies or the guy who might be your boss and is kind of stuffy about you not using swear words at all, right? Now, if you say everything is a social construct, there is no objective truth apart from what we as a society or a culture create, and all of that is about power, then things like race don't really exist, except insofar as white society makes up a concept of race to justify oppression. Gender doesn't really exist, except that the patriarchy invents gender to oppress people. So let's look at tweet number 1 and tweet number 2. So tweet number 1 I saw last week was there was this whole little interesting kerfuffle. It didn't really blow up and be massive, but I would definitely say there was a mini little Twitter war about whether bisexual lesbians exist. And the tweet I saw, which started all this, came from a fake news journalist from the Daily Dot. And she writes, "The phrase bisexual lesbian is perfectly valid. Words are fluid. They are malleable, open to change, and used based on the interpretation of them. Please stop harassing and dogpiling queers different from you over the internet." So she is saying a bisexual lesbian is a valid thing you can be. Now, of course, a lot of people gave her flack for this. And actually, the majority of people seemed to think this was nonsense and she was doing something bad. They argued that she was being transphobic, she was being biphobic, she was being lesbophobic because she was erasing the lesbian identity and the bisexual identity by combining these terms. So the argument against bisexual lesbians is pretty simple. A bisexual, that word means something. It means you're attracted to two sexes. You have sexual attraction to men and to women, right? Lesbian, what does that mean? Well, it means you're a woman who's attracted to women. So if you're a lesbian, you can't be bisexual. If you're bisexual, you can't be a lesbian, right? But that's a objective sort of facts don't care about your feelings way of looking at language. So even though most people were disagreeing with this journalist who thinks that bisexual lesbians exist, I actually think that the postmodern argument is on her side. These are just terms of art. These are terms that can be redefined if you want. If all gender identities are valid and you want to identify as a bisexual lesbian, well, what's to stop you? Well, what's to stop you is other SJWs calling you a phobic, accusing you of doing violence to lesbians and bisexuals, accusing you of erasing these identities. Like, both sides use the same arguments. Speech is violence to try to silence each other. But I think in the long run, the argument that you can be a bisexual lesbian will win, because what's a lesbian anymore if we don't know what a woman is? Like, when I was a kid, the word lesbian meant something because I knew what a woman was. A woman is born a woman. What is she sexually attracted to? She's sexually attracted to other women. She's lesbian. But if you can decide what your sexual identity is, and that isn't just you identifying as the opposite sex, that's actually you becoming the opposite sex, or you were the opposite sex the whole time, and no one knew until you came out, and you always were. If I came out today and said I'm a woman, it's not just I'm saying I'm a woman, I always was a woman. Well, once we get to that point, the word lesbian doesn't really mean anything anymore. And there was a little moment where you could see people joking about this. Like, if a man identifies as a woman and is sexually attracted to women, he's a lesbian, but he still has a penis, but he says he's a woman. Or if this creates problems, like if there's a lesbian couple and one of the lesbians decides to identify as a man, is the lesbian who still identifies as a woman, is she no longer gay? Is she no longer a lesbian, or has she transformed into straight? And my guess is because the New Left isn't concerned about logical consistency, because the New Left isn't concerned about objective, sort of straightforward logical categories, because they think these are social constructs, what'll end up happening is they'll accept some sort of contradiction that just ends up benefiting the largest group of people possible. So whatever increases the number of people with a victimized, marginalized identity to the biggest number possible, that's the compromise they'll settle on, if they ever settle. Or maybe they just go on warring forever. What's maybe actually more interesting than can you be a bisexual lesbian is, can a cis man identify as a cis woman? Can a cis man identify as a trans man? Other people, I think, have made this point besides me, but what I think is really important about the word cis as a prefix to cis man or cis woman is it actually says the same thing as man or woman, but it's allegedly less offensive. They added it because apparently it's offensive to say man and trans man, because that's implying that the trans man isn't a real man. So we need a new suffix, cis man, to differentiate a man who's born with male genitalia from a man who is born with female genitalia and chooses to identify as a man. See? But the second you introduce the word cis, you are acknowledging that there's actually a biological category, and that this is important enough that you need a word to define it. If it was really true that a woman who identifies as a man is a man, just period, full stop, not even a trans man, just a woman who identifies as a man is a man, then you wouldn't need a new term to differentiate that man from a cis man. The word acknowledges the reality they don't want to acknowledge. So, gosh. So where I was going with that is, could a cis man identify as a cis woman? Well, no, not according to the way the words are used. Well, what if a cis man really wanted to identify as a cis woman as his identity? Well, then the term wouldn't mean anything anymore. Now, why is this? Why do they have a term, cis man and cis woman, that effectively says the same thing as man and woman, just makes it sound less offensive? It's like the difference between person of color and colored person. They're really they describe the same thing. I think they have it because of the power dynamics thing and the belief they need to seize power and impose power over the oppressor classes. So if you believe you need to take power and then correct historical injustices against trans people by cis people, then you need a category to identify the oppressor. The cis people, they're the oppressor. They're the ones who've historically benefited from patriarchy and cis heteronormativity. If reparations ever comes to the trans community, they will need the cis category to differentiate those who will pay the reparations from those who will receive the reparations. Never mind that the use of the term undermines their own argument that a man actually can become a woman in reality. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if there's an objective reality that contradicts their use of language, because they see the use of language as their tool to power. All right. So the second one, the related one, is a blue check mark writing PSA, white people don't get to decide what's racist. And again, I've seen this over and over again. This isn't it's sad, like the Twitter, when it's become clear that Twitter giving you a blue check mark is kind of an acknowledgement that Twitter thinks you're cool because they take blue check marks away from people they think are bad. And the joke is blue check mark means you probably are racist against white people, right? There's an oddly suspicious amount of angry tweets about white people from blue check marks, right? So nothing new about that. But remember what I said about everything being a social construct? Okay. If race is a social construct, if it doesn't really exist except in the minds of the racist white power structure, how do you know what a white person is as opposed to a black person? Well, in real world, in kind of normal logic land, you can look at both and you can say, well, there's a different amount of melatonin in their skin color. And there you go. That's it. That allows you to acknowledge that, this person looks a little different from this person. But in intersectional theory, all that is a social construct. We've invented that white people, the white patriarchy, has invented the concept of race for the express purpose of oppressing marginalized people, right? Based on superficial characteristics. So if you're going to have reparations and demand that white people, pay back money for this historic injustice, if I'm expected to pay for things that were done hundreds of years ago by people who may not have been my ancestors at all, how are they going to identify me as the person who needs to pay it? Well, they're obviously going to use their eyes, look at me and say, oh, you're white. If I say, oh yeah, I'll take a genetic heredity test to see if I have one drop of black blood in me, and if I don't have it, well then I'm stuck. I'm going to have to pay the tax for the reparation. But that assumes that there's actually a real biological thing you can observe. Like racists will try to, I think, overemphasize the racial division between people, but there are actually like slight differences you can determine between different races that were not socially constructed. You could argue racism is a social construct. The attitude that certain races are inferior, that is something that people have to invent and certain societies and cultures have to invent. But if you start with the position that there is no objective truth, there is no transcendent truth, if you're an existentialist, essentially, the meanings that we give to things don't have any truth beyond the meanings we give to them, then I think you end up devolving into this cycle. So the reason I did this is I think this is the first time I kind of put two and two together, that there's a parallel problem for the racial identity politics position and sort of the gender identity or the sexual orientation identity politics. They may not seem like they have much overlap at first, but they do have this overlap of trying to deconstruct the previous culture. And I think there is a root in subjectivism or relativism in both that leads to them having sort of irreconcilable logical problems. You can't reconcile this problem unless you give up racism, unless you give up bigotry, unless you say white people don't owe reparations to any black people, unless you say straight people don't owe reparations to any gay people, cis hetero people don't owe any sort of moral debt to trans people. That you need the moral category. You need objective category distinctions to be able to make an us versus them. So this is the problem I see for the left. I don't see it going away anytime soon, and this was just an interesting illustration of it. All right, tangent contained. Now I won't accidentally talk about this while reviewing some manga and get that poor manga review demonetized. I'm no more Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.